Monika's been preparing for this presentation for about a couple of decades at least. And I'll give you a little bit of her background to lay the groundwork for that. It begins north, way north, at the University of Alberta, where she received her degree in petroleum engineering. And I think, was it as cold there as it is in this room? From there, she went in as a practicing petroleum engineer, and she worked in that area for several years, doing oil and gas engineering. And for those of you that practice in the oil and gas area, you'll know that the petroleum engineers are kind of on a pedestal all by themselves in the industry. After working in the oil and gas area, she also worked in the energy trading area. She was an analyst for a commodity risk group, and from there she decided to go to law school. And she ended up at SMU at the Devon Law School, working with John Lowe, who's a colleague and dear friend of mine, and also a mentor of mine. And John became Monika's mentor as well. And law professors talk about their students, and I heard about Monika early on when she was studying at SMU. And John had told me at that time that he thought she was going to be a major influence in legal education, and particularly in the oil and gas area. And that's certainly true. Monika went from law school and she went to work for Lockwood, which is a major firm in Texas, and an international firm. From there, she went to Pioneer Natural Resources. She was a senior counsel in-house there. And from there, she went as general counsel for a private independent oil company in Dallas. Along the way, she decided she wanted to teach, and she ended up getting her LLM from Yale Law School, and then was hired at Oklahoma University. One of the things you should know about OU, the person I identify as probably the intellectual foundation of oil and gas law is a man named Gene Coombs. And Gene taught at the University of Oklahoma for about 30, 40 years. And he handpicked a successor, which is Owen Anderson, who was another colleague of mine. And Owen then picked his successor, and that happens to be Monika. So she is running the oil and gas program at the University of Oklahoma, is recognized as a scholar, a teacher, particularly a teacher in this area, because she's so well respected by her students. She goes far out of her way to help them to experience their legal education. She's well known for getting folks out in the field and meeting the practicing lawyers. And she's also somebody who is very well known and respected by the practicing bar. Her work with the Rocky Mountain Mineral Law Foundation, she's recognized as one of the leaders in that area, and she'll continue to do that in the years to come, I know. I could recount several of the acts of kindness of Monika through the years, but one I think all of you will appreciate here is that she met Daniel Kirksey, who's one of our students, recent graduates, and she had contact with him at several institutes that Daniel was at. And when it came time to start looking for work, Monika being tied in closely with the Houston job market, where Daniel wanted to go, Monika was instrumental in bringing him together with some of the folks that ultimately hired him. And that's just the kind of person she is. One of my favorite people. I'll give you Monika.
Hi, can everyone hear me in the back? All right? Okay, and in the front. So, thank you so much to Professor Pierson for that lovely introduction. I'm simply just paying it forward and trying to do as much good that Professor Pierce and the colleagues So I'm so happy to see such great turnout from the students here. So glad that your professors, incredible Bert Briggs and Freddie Sorgens, encourage you to come. The other professors who are here too, that it is important. This is your community. It is your family. It's the people that you will see throughout your practice. And that's a big takeaway about being a member of the bar. So we're here today to talk about the idea of truth and fact. And it comes at a critical point in our country's future. But it's also critical in terms of where we're going with respect to energy and our energy future. And I'm very happy to speak to this issue. So I think our keynote, Professor Strong, gave such an incredible framework for today's presentations. The idea of what is truth, what is language, what do words mean, and the impact of words on action and response. The idea of energy, then, is tied very closely to law, not simply in the fact of the respect of energy law as a form of regulatory law, FERC, or oil and gas law, sort of real property characteristics tied in with contract and tort that make up oil and gas law, but the idea of what is language. What does language affect on energy, environment, and science? And so, I would put to you that as lawyers, as law students, that we're masters or mastering continually the art of language. That language is the basis for law. And we find that in terms of logic, in terms of argument. We argue before a court. We argue with our community. We argue to promote a truth or an ideal, or to promote a vision for our client. But science also has a language. And in science, that language is mathematics. And so it was with that sort of idea, I thought to myself, why aren't the worlds of energy, which is science, the consumption, the use of energy in terms of kilojoules, calorie, BTU for natural gas, the idea of energy is science. It's founded on the language of science. Environment, too, is scientifically based. And so the idea of the two worlds, energy and environment, both founded on science, not being able to speak the same language. And that has repercussion if we don't speak to each other. And, as our panelists have talked about today, if we don't hear each other, if we don't understand each other. So what I'll talk to you today then is about what we're seeing in terms of oil and gas and of energy in the United States. I'm going to focus mostly domestic, but also this is happening internationally. There are a lot of anti-petroleum efforts. Some of it is sort of broader, obviously, anti-extractive industries, focus on mining, coal. I'm going to focus this presentation on petroleum. So it's sort of anti-petroleum hydrocarbon efforts. We'll talk about then, is it possible to, at this point, move away from petroleum? So the idea of bringing in, what is the reality? And it's this sort of reality, this focus on reality that I've kind of termed energy realism. So if we move away from energy, what are the repercussions? What happens? So we follow through on an argument till we come to its conclusion that's either logical or that's illogical. The other idea is the idea of adoption of energy realism. So when we talk to each other, are we actually speaking the same language? Are we actually sort of founded or based on an idea of what energy means for us? So there are a lot of movements that have come about, and yesterday's midterm election saw a lot of the culmination of those movements tied to certain propositions, and I'll talk to you today about some of those. So the Keep It in the Ground movement is a movement that's really come about in the last decade. We had a traditional focus of sort of anti-extractive industry or environmentalism. It was always tied to consequences. So if there is flaring, or if there's combustion, or if there's tailpipe emissions from automobiles, then we should look at the idea of smog. We look at the idea of pollution, the sort of effects of water pollution, and there's litigation that surrounds that. So the current movement is really tied to the idea that we look at the promulgation, the origin, sort of the origin story of where this pollution comes from.
And so that is tied then to the movement's focus on looking at the start of the extractive industry. So instead of examining or litigating the consequences of environmental degradation or pollution, the effects of which are real and tied to extractive industries, then we should look at stopping extractive industry from happening. So with the Bureau of Land Management, with lands on federal leases, those are tied to obviously public lands and to the mandate of an auction. So going and tying up those lease sales so that you don't even get to the point of first drilling. You don't get to the point of extraction. You don't get to the point of a midstream or transportation infrastructure put in place. You prevent the lease sale. So looking at the movement's focus on that, in addition to focusing on sort of transportation projects. So the Dakota Access Pipeline, focusing on how do we prevent hydrocarbons from being moved across the country, and focusing efforts on this. But with that sort of movement, and with these other movements that we see in the form of public movements and public propositions, there come consequences tied to them. And that, I argue, is what we aren't having the entire dialogue. We're failing to speak to each other about what the consequences or what the ramifications are of these types of movements. So in Colorado, one of the propositions that just failed yesterday, and which was so closely watched by the energy industry and the citizens of Colorado, was Proposition 112. And this was with respect to setback distances. So Kansas Corporation Commission, Oklahoma Corporation, the Railroad Commission in Texas, we have this regulation of oil and gas production. And that regulation includes this idea of promoting development, prohibiting waste, protecting correlative rights, and other sort of traditional regulatory mechanism. So the setback distance was, on this proposition, was to be moved or increased so that it was 2,500 feet from certain points. And in effect, if this proposition had succeeded, it would have prohibited or prevented drilling on 85% of Colorado land. So with a $35 billion a year industry and economy at stake, obviously the energy industry spent a lot of money trying to convince Coloradans that they should not vote for this proposition, that there would be an impact on jobs, on the economy. But one of the things I thought was not discussed was the impact on energy, the impact on industrial use. And so this presentation not only focuses on what those seeking to prevent extractive industry do and communicate, but what does the energy industry do? How does it fail to properly communicate? How does it properly fail to sort of complete the equation in the sort of language of math and science? Now, the other sort of thought about this idea of language is that in science, we have laws. And one of those laws is the first law of thermodynamics. And in the first law of thermodynamics, it states that all energy is constant in the universe, which means energy can neither be created nor can it be destroyed. So energy is very much tied in everything that we do here. So we are chemical energy, sort of components of chemical energy, the energy between molecular bonds. And that energy then we use either through combustion, if it's in a hydrocarbon. For humans, we move, we use kinetic energy. That chemical energy is transformed to some sort of kinetic energy. And we can get up, pick our lunch boxes up, and sit down again. In hydrocarbons, it's the same thing. The idea of the origin story of petroleums. Millions of years ago, we had dinosaurs, plant life, organic material that over time becomes compressed and heated and under pressure turns into hydrocarbon. So the idea of a biological energy transforming into some sort of chemical energy that we release through combustion into other forms of energy for our lights, for our heat, for our transportation. And so with this focus, I feel that people are forgetting where our energy comes from. We still rely heavily on petroleum. And petroleum, of course, oil and gas are sort of the petroleum hydrocarbon components. And so for natural gas, we consume a lot of it for power generation. And for petroleum, for crude oil, a lot of that, almost 90%, goes to transportation. So the movement for fuels, for rail, for jet fuel. So how a lot of us came here today, how our food comes in, how our food is transported. And it's all within this web and framework that completes the sort of full picture of what energy looks like. And so when you have two sides, I hate to use the word side because all of a sudden then it seems like a very antagonistic word. So when we have sort of two pieces of the dialogue and they don't understand the full equation, it's difficult to have a conversation. It's difficult to build trust. And as we've heard through the panel this morning, the keynote speaker, without trust, we can't really have a clear set. We can't really communicate clearly. So a foundational understanding of where energy comes from, of what we use energy to do, is important if we want to have energy and environment speak with each other, because it's the same language and it's the same idea of energy. So the industrial challenge is if we remove energy, if we take away oil and gas from sort of American use or international use, we have big impacts in the transportation sector, in electric power generation. And right now there are a lot of projects towards renewable energy. And will we evolve? Will we become users of a renewable energy, either a low carbon or zero carbon solution? Absolutely. Evolutionary sort of precepts, they dictate that we will move towards more efficient uses of energy. And just as we moved from biofuels into coal, and from coal into the petroleum hydrocarbon age after World War II, so we will move into some other energy source. So what we need to think about, what we need to focus on, especially as these two parties, energy and environment, speak to each other, is the realism of, can we do so at this time? Is it reasonable to think that we can move away from petroleum hydrocarbons to a zero carbon renewable future within a decade? Now, some states have already taken on that challenge. So California has a goal that by 2040, that they will move to a sort of zero carbon future. But there are a lot of other states which are more reluctant to face that. Not at the legislative, not at the sort of industry lobbying or environmental lobbying effort, at the consumer effort. And so that's the other part of this conversation, is that it is not just energy and environment. It is not just oil and gas company and environmentalist. We're forgetting the consumer. The consumer is the key critical component of dialogue that is missing in this. The consumer is also the taxpayer. And so when solutions come forward in the terms of like propositions on the ballot, so Arizona had a proposition on the ballot that would have made it easier for renewable energy projects to go forward. And it failed because it's going to cost more to adapt these more expensive solutions, these more expensive technologies. Similarly, in Washington, there was another sort of proposition on the ballot to attach a fee to emissions of carbon dioxide. So a type of, you could call it type of carbon tax, but a fee on carbon dioxide emissions. And except for King County, where Seattle is located, it too failed. Because the idea of the consumer bearing a fee, having to pay for something, is something the consumer doesn't want, the voter doesn't want. But that's the missing piece of this. It's not just generator and then the sort of end result, consequence, externality, environment protector. It's the consumer. And we need to bring the consumer back. And I would argue we would do that with market type solutions, because there are economic challenges with moving away from oil and gas and petroleum hydrocarbons. So if we remove petroleum hydrocarbons, but the supply side, we don't remove demand, well, what happens to price? That's an Econ 101 sort of basic idea. So if we can't immediately transform, today use natural gas, tomorrow we're going to use solar or wind power, then who's going to pay for that? Where does that power come from? For those of you taking sort of FERC regulatory practice, the molecules are going to move. So our electric transportation grid moves with electrons zipping along those lines. And those electrons, whether they were generated using wind, which turns a turbine, which creates electricity, or natural gas, which is combusted, or coal, combusted to heat water, to create steam, to turn a turbine and create electricity, something has to turn the turbine. So if I remove hydrocarbons, then for electric power generation, something has to turn the turbine. And wind and solar and hydro at this time are not enough. Will they one day be? They will, but not at this time. And so unless we then, the consumer, are ready to accept that there are going to be consequences while we journey along this evolutionary path, that there will be rotating brownouts like there are in most of the rest of the world, that there isn't a guarantee that your DVR for Game of Thrones is going to work 24 hours a day, that we can get people from not calling the utility a minute after you lose power or 10 seconds and then angrily tweeting it and posting your sad face on Instagram. We have to, as my dad told me when I asked for a car upon graduation from high school, manage our expectations. I got a bus pass. So that is the idea where not only is it about communicating the reality of energy use, of generation, of consumption, of bringing efficiency back into the equation, but of making sure we have all stakeholders involved. It's not just ExxonMobil versus the rest of the world. It is consumers, voters, electorate, the environmentalists, the scientists, the engineers, the oil and gas companies, the royalty interest owners. It's all those components getting together and understanding what we are speaking about and the realities of our action or inaction with respect to climate change. Now, there are political challenges, obviously, and I think one of the themes about the sort of Trump administration the last 2 years has been this sort of push to getting rid of regulation. That regulation sort of stands in the way as a hamper or as a sort of hindrance, and so the rollback in the Department of Interior with BLM regulations, venting, flaring with respect to the Clean Power Plan, with the EPA, this has immediate consequences. But, as you will study, of course, in administrative law, which we were talking about, is very important to take. As we talk about it, it's not just easy to make an executive order saying that you are not going to follow a certain regulation, that there is still a process. And that is part of your job when you graduate to the law students. For those of you that are in the bar, that is our job, to look at regulation, to make sure that laws are followed, processes are followed. But it's also to examine the idea of policy and what's behind it. So in the Western states, there's a focus. So the Western states, we have a large holding of public lands. And so the idea of the states' rights issue has come about. So if for those living on the land, using the land, the sort of disconnect between what happens far off in the Washington sort of D.C. in the halls of Congress versus what happens to the use of ranch lands, of groundwater rights, of rights for agricultural, for oil and gas, we need to understand that there is a disconnect there, and that part of our role is to communicate. The other idea is this idea of getting away from the energy dominance that President Trump has talked about, but even energy independence. Energy independence, and this is a sort of brilliant insight from our colleague, Professor John Lowe, who said there really isn't such a thing as energy independence. And this is kind of sad because energy independence came up during President Nixon's administration, after sort of the era of oil embargoes, all of this sort of political discord, and President Nixon said, we are going to have energy independence in America. And with the advent of hydraulic fracturing, with the sort of shale revolution, with the United States for the first time in decades able to export natural gas in the form of LNG, of being sort of not wholly reliant on others, we would think President Nixon, you were vindicated. And that might be the first time that Nixon and vindication were used in the same sentence. But unfortunately, with independence, with dominance, as our colleague, Professor Lowe, has stated, that's just not right. It doesn't work. It's interrelational. It's cooperative, to borrow from the earlier panels. That is what energy is about. Just like the molecular ties that bind everything in this room, the kinetic, the chemical energy between your molecules, the plastic polymers in the carpet, all of the manufacturing of this room, the energy source, everything is sort of connected together. And I made a very kind of Morpheus and the Matrix statement right there. So you can all sort of see these bonds. But what we need to think is, how do we communicate this in this sort of era of political uncertainty, of the idea of people not trusting in each other? And trust is another important factor in the energy environment dialogue. Now, internationally, there are obvious ramifications of moving away from petroleum hydrocarbons. There's this sort of political, again, instability, the idea of sort of energy dominance and issues rising in the South China Sea, very sort of volatile, politically volatile area. And of course, impacts in the Middle East have sort of ramifications on our commodity prices, energy trading, and energy supply. But there are also challenges that the industry faces, and that the oil and gas industry has to start addressing. And one of those is there are externalities, negative, associated with oil and gas development. As I have told my students, we don't manufacture rainbows and unicorns and lollipops when it comes to petroleum hydrocarbons. And even in a manufacturing plant for rainbows and unicorns and lollipops, it's a manufacturing process. It's industrial. And so we have lost, too, that idea of recognizing what industrial development looks like. And part of that disconnect, again, with roots in the energy, the environment, the consumer, we don't live on the land. So the traditional sort of formation of natural resources law, Clyde March, the scholar under the Rocky Mountain Mineral Law Foundation, honors as sort of the creator of natural resources law. It was very extractive. Natural resources law was agricultural law, water law for consumptive use, oil and gas law, mining law, timber, all of these areas of how to use the land, use the resources. And we were more connected, either your parents' generation, your grandparents' generation, whether you were an immigrant, whether you've been here for 100, 200 years. We farmed. We were tied to the land in some sort of close fashion. And we now no longer realize or are aware of where our energy comes from. It comes from industrial processes. Just like if I want to have my bottle of plastic water here, that's an industrial process. If we want to purchase Patagonia clothing, that's an industrial process. Everything is. And just like all of these industrial processes, for energy source, whether it comes from wind or solar or coal or oil and gas, there are going to be benefits to use and burdens of not use. And so with the use of solar panels, you need rare earth metallics in order to manufacture the solar panels. Abundance of the rare earth comes from China. And so in China, they mine a heavy industrial extractive process. A lot of the wastewater that's used is just dumped. So it flows into the groundwater. So people in China then are bearing sort of negative externalities associated with something that we, an ocean over, who don't see these externalities, who don't see these effects, that we think and associate something very clean. The same with our cell phone batteries. The same is true for wind, which uses plastics, which need petroleum products, and of course for oil and gas. So again, a recognition, the idea of this energy realism concept of where our oil and gas, where anything industrial comes from. But the industry needs to do a better job of accepting that there are these externalities. There are noise emissions.
The idea for the students, when you go out into practice of what makes effective sort of negotiators is, and that's not just negotiation, but it's also an ADR, in any type of conflict resolution, you have to be empathetic with the counterparty. You have to sort of understand or appreciate where they are coming from, what path they are walking down. And so if I'm a landowner, a service owner, I don't have an associated royalty interest, I have no stream of revenue tied to oil and gas development, and I have to stare at a pump jack and tanks, and there are trucks that have bashed in my mailbox for the 4th time that month, I'm going to be upset. And so accepting that there are these effects are really important. And induced seismicity is a big issue here in Kansas and Oklahoma. So in Sumner County, Harbor County, in the sort of central, north central Oklahoma area, we have induced seismicity issues where wastewater, which is produced from the formation water associated with oil and gas development, or from the water used for hydraulic fracturing purposes, after it's flowed back or after it's produced, it has to be disposed of. It needs to be then, it usually is injected into a wastewater well. When it's injected, that injection mechanism transforms that energy into wave energy, and it then can impact faults, and that's causing earthquakes. So the oil and gas industry, I think, was very quick here, the Corporation Commission of Kansas and Oklahoma, in coming to terms with seismicity and sort of reducing wastewater impacts, mapping geographic faults, and keeping a close eye on this, understanding that it concerns people that earthquakes should not happen without some sort of knowledge and without some sort of aim in reducing earthquakes associated with oil and gas operations. But other states like Texas have been far more slow. And I would argue that that's not a good thing for our industry, that the action or inaction of one, whether it's correct or not correct, undeniably sort of taints the entire. So being more forthright about these externalities is really important for the oil and gas industry as well. And that includes the contribution to climate change. So again, going back to the lesson of language, the language of math that Energy Environment speaks, that when the International or Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, when scientists, when governments for decades have been speaking about climate change, that any engineer, any scientist can tell you that hydrocarbon plus oxygen plus source, any combustive, is going to have a production of some carbon dioxide. If it is a non-clean, non-pure, meaning some of the carbon is not completely combusted, you're going to have methane. So methane, carbon dioxide in the environment, that's not a good thing. But what we're missing here with this sort of contribution to climate change externality is that some of the companies, they want to address this. And so what they said, sort of James Baker, or former Secretary of State, James Baker has a platform on carbon tax. So ExxonMobil, BP, Chevron, a lot of the independents have asked for carbon tax. And so the argument from the corporate side is a carbon tax is a known. We can plan for a carbon tax, whereas moratorium, bans on high-fluid hydraulic fracturing that the state of New York passed, these are political risks that we can't plan for. And so ExxonMobil recently contributed $1 million to former Secretary of State James Baker and former Secretary of Treasury Paulson. There's a bunch of conservatives that came together with this plan, carbon tax, and then we'll issue a dividend every quarter back to the citizen. So a non-revenue carbon tax. I would argue that maybe, this is very Canadian of me, that we would take some of the money and invest it in renewables, invest it in making it cheaper to go forward with wind, with solar. Hydro is kind of tapped out or has maximum capacity, but micro hydro, tidal power. But the idea here with the conservative platform was, let's have a solution then. If carbon tax makes it easier for companies to gauge risks, and that would mean, of course, as this tied to it, that there wouldn't be climate change litigation, we would instead focus on a solution, focus on a methodology,
and this was voted down in Congress.
So it's funny we talk about headlines and post-truth. So in researching this, you'll see, I think I remember the date now, it's like July 17th, and it says, conservatives push for carbon tax. And then July 18th, it says, conservatives vote down carbon tax. And that's what happened, saying that the consumer didn't want to bear a tax, that anything that looks like a tax or is called a tax is unpalatable to the American consumer. But is it? Maybe we just need to bring the American consumer back into the conversation. So this idea of energy realism then is that there is a necessary need for hydrocarbons, and that this necessary or necessity is required both domestically and internationally, and that we can't have these conversations between energy and environment without including government and consumer, without including those who talk about not just environmental justice, but energy justice. So the poor, the impoverished, about 1/4 of Americans rely on some kind of subsidy for from the government in terms of energy use, in terms of water. So focusing on those sort of disparate groups, most of which are either minority, the low-income groups, who require air conditioning and electric power in the summer or heat during the winter. That there are groups that cannot afford that don't have access to sort of food security, internationally, water security, energy security. Those are all tied into this concept of energy justice. So remembering that justice is important, environmental justice is important, but it is tied to and a part of the same language that energy justice speaks to. So looking then at what you can do, what we can do, goes back to looking at consumption, focusing on demand side, the idea of carbon tax, the idea of efficiency, the idea of making, perhaps if we're not going to understand or treat power as something so valuable that we make it more expensive. Again, this then ties back to the idea of energy justice, and then how do we make energy affordable for groups that can't afford to pay. So with this idea then of energy realism, I think it really comes down to education and awareness. So maybe this isn't something that can be addressed with just a simple, next year, the 2020 elections. Maybe it's not that simple. Maybe it's generational. It's going back to the age of the greatest generation, those who lived through the Great Depression. The idea of doing without, of having to eat thistles. There's an incredible book called The Worst Hard Times that talks about the challenges faced in Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, this area of what they did, of eating Russian thistle, it's just absolutely incredible. And maybe that's what it goes back to, is tying back this generational need of teaching children, where does energy come from? What does energy consumption look like? What are the repercussions of climate change? What happens if our world becomes unlivable? Now with climate change, and especially with the IPCC sort of recent statement, maybe we don't have the luxury of that time. Maybe it won't happen, it can't happen, we can't wait a generation. I'm going to leave it to your good hands, to our good hands, to sort of think and have these conversations. But in the end, what this comes down to is the idea of communication, of dialogue, and of understanding that science is fact, science is founded in truth, that's why we have things called scientific truths, and that energy and environment do need to speak to each other. I wanted to just sort of finish this presentation with reminding you of why I am so happy to be here and what a privilege it is to be here. That Professor David Pierce is part of that generation of oil and gas law professor that are the giants of oil and gas law. There are 8 in this country, and here we have sitting with us of your law school, of this law school in the state of Kansas, one of the top 8 oil and gas law giants. That he spoke of Dean Eugene Koontz, Walker from University of Texas, from Columbia, Williams and Myers. That was the greatest oil and gas law generation. And they taught and mentored and brought in another generation of giants. And so Professor David Pierce, for those of you who have him, for those of you that were taught by him, For those of you like me and my friends here in the front row, Dr. Griggs and Professor Sorgens, who are mentored and are privileged to call him friend, I want you to know how incredible his legacy is. The Kansas Oil and Gas Law Handbook, Dean Kuntz's sort of treatise on oil and gas law, cases and materials on oil and gas law. He has literally written an article on almost every topic in oil and gas and continues to reshape the future of oil and gas law. So we have productive discussions like this. And you are also very lucky to have the future of oil and gas law and natural resources law. So we have Professor Sorgens, who is an incredible scholar of international petroleum, international arbitration, putting Washburn University, putting Kansas and the US on a global map. And of course our incredible Dr. Burt Griggs, just an incredible, tireless advocate in the field of water law, of looking at resources law, agricultural law, and of course oil and gas law. So to remember that not only are you from a legacy of oil and gas and energy, but you are also being shaped by people who are shaping the future. So thank you very much.